Thank you very much again from our side for your participation and your contribution, especially in the chat boxes. For us personally, it has been 2 amazing days. So thank you very much for that. So we're switching gears a little bit now, and I think this is also extremely important for editors on this forum to try and understand also the work that SANLIC is doing. SANLIC, the South African National Library and Information Consortium, when negotiating commercial licenses for libraries, etc. So there's this whole debate and this whole balance that has to take place with open access and, of course, subscription fees. We've invited 3 members of SANLIC to actually join us this afternoon. 2 will be presenting. The third author of all this work being done will not be on this call this afternoon. I would like to introduce to you, first of all, Tise. She's the Senior Director of Library and Information Services at Stellenbosch University. She has quite some notable roles, leadership roles out there. She served as the first president of the Library and Information Association of South Africa from 1998 to 2002, and president of the International Federation of Library Associations, IFLA in short, and for the years from 2009 to 2011. She's just started a 2nd-year term for a very interesting project as the Freedom of Access to Information and Freedom of Expression Advisory Committee of IFLA. Our second speaker then would be Glenn Truran, who has been the director of SANLIC since 2014 and works from home in Cape Town. After graduating from the University of the Witwatersrand with a BA in Higher Diploma Education, postgraduate diploma, he worked briefly as an educator in South Africa and England, and subsequently completed a diploma in Public Policy and Development Administration at the University of Witwatersrand, and in 2003 received his MBA for the University of Cape Town. Before joining SANLIC, Glenn worked in several educational and poverty alleviation non-profit organizations and also involved very actively in SANLIC's open access transformational agreements task team. Before I hand over then to Ellen to perhaps kick off this presentation, I just want to mention, I'm sure that there are parts of South Africa celebrating the fact that we have been downgraded to level 2 electricity reductions, etc. But in my region, it will start at 2 o'clock. So at 2 o'clock, when I just disappear, I have asked my colleague Ina just to take over from me. And just to continue, it will be in the discussion time while we get our generator up and running to ensure smart and quick transition. So my sincerest apologies for that. Under level 3, I would not have had that challenge, but I definitely have that challenge now. So Ellen and Glenn, we are really looking forward to what you have to share with us this afternoon, and therefore I then cross over to you, Ellen.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction, and as well as inviting us to share with you this afternoon the work and the progress, I would say, that SANLIC was able to do over the last 4 years, and in terms of how we're transitioning to open access in South Africa. So I am the deputy chair of the SANLIC board, and as Susan had indicated, the chair of the board, Laila Vahed, she's unfortunately not able to join us this afternoon. And then, of course, I'm here joined by Glenn Truran, who is director of SANLIC. And SANLIC, the South African National Library Consortium, basically representing all the higher education and research institutions in the country via their libraries. And as Susan had said, we've been involved in and responsible for negotiating national licenses for institutions in terms of a journal article output. Of course, that has, as we know, the scholarly communication, publishing, sector has undergoing major changes over the last number of years, specifically with regard to the open access movement. Many of the institutions have signed the original Berlin Declaration on Open Access, and that was in 2003 already. It had its up and downs, but certainly with the AO 2020 movement, it sort of had a new injection in terms of addressing the unsustainable cost of providing access to research output of institutions. And as such, Stanley also had become involved in shifting gear instead of just focusing on licensing published research output, that we also participating in the more actively in the open access movement. That had led as one of the major things that we will be presenting this afternoon with you in terms of the publishing data analysis project that Stanley has undertaken. It is a project that had emerged out of the involvement in the National Site Licensing Project, which had then became the National Site Licensing and Open Access Project. It was also the result of networking with other library consortia and engagement with the, as I indicated, the Open Access 2020 movement. And once the OA 2020 concept of transformative agreements was embraced by South Africa's vice chancellors, the idea of a data analysis project was envisaged as one of the 6 steps in the roadmap of the journey towards open access in South Africa. Of course, there have also been other initiatives. Importantly, this was absolutely critical in order for South Africa to really start engaging and first to look at what does the data tells us, what the data tells us in terms of where do we publish, etc., and so on. In addition to this, there have been other initiatives such as Stanley had then developed a statement on open access to say exactly what are the things that we need to look at, that we will have to look at before we embark on any transformative, and as we see it as transformational agreements, to ensure that we come up with a model that works for South Africa and also, you know, for the rest of the continent. So that was then one of the first things that we, a second thing that we had worked on. And then thirdly, out of that, once we've made certain recommendations, we then came up with principles that will guide then negotiations. Once we have had the data, as that Glenn will present now, based on that, we then developed these principles for negotiations, and based on that, we decided that we can now proceed with some of these negotiations. And that's basically what we will be sharing with you this afternoon. So over to Glenn.
Thank you, Ellen and Susan. Can you hear me all right? Could you just nod, Ellen, if it's okay? Can you hear me and see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to present the data and contextualize the data as well. So the problem that we were looking to address was the fact that South Africa's publishing is predominantly behind a paywall, and that this is at the expense of the open science objectives that the country has. I think I don't need to dwell too long on the financial challenges that the country is facing and was facing before COVID-19 came along. I think all of the higher education institutions are aware that their funding has been cut by government and that further cuts are expected in the coming years. added to this, the costs of reading subscriptions were becoming unsustainable on their own, and as more and more researchers published open access, there was the additional cost of publishing fees or article processing charges. So the burning question for us was, if all journals were to become open access, would South Africa be better or worse off? Just a key point to emphasize the financial challenges. You may have heard of the McDonald's index, the Big Mac index. When you compare the purchasing power parity of the South African rand against the British pound and the US dollar, you'll notice that we've lost half of our purchasing power in the last 10 years. So theoretically, unless if we had not thrown more money at the problem, we would be able to only read half as much as we used to be able to read. So why the research output data analysis? It's useful because it can inform our open access strategy. It helps us to determine what is viable in terms of specific agreements with specific publishers. It improves our ability to prepare for negotiations, and it helps us to determine what outcome we want from those negotiations. And also, as in this case, it assists with communication with our stakeholders. So what do we mean by a transformative agreement? And in South Africa, we're looking at more specific criteria that we're calling transformational, but the international term used is transformative agreements. And the key components are that they are temporary in nature and transitional, usually a period of 3 to 5 years. The idea is that authors retain their copyright. Authors can continue to publish immediate open access in journals that were previously closed. The agreements have to be transparent. The intention is that it would be cost neutral for the institutions that participate, and therefore provide some sort of financial stability to assist publishers to adjust to a new model. And the whole idea is to transition smoothly from paying to read to paying to publish. So forgive me if you know all of this, but I think it's quite important to just be clear on the terms and definitions that we're using. Stanley negotiates for subscription agreements that cover hybrid and closed journals that are behind the paywall or the gate. However, when researchers publish open access, at an article level, they would be paying some sort of article processing charge unless there was another form of funding, or a colleague is funding the research. And that would be either in gold open access, fully gold open access journals, or in hybrid journals that are behind the paywall but allow you to publish open access. And but they wouldn't be paying for bronze, because that, in the case of bronze, the publisher determines when it will be open to read. So the APCs apply to those two. And I'd just like to show you how this has impacted on the international scene using a study conducted by Delta Think. So what you'll see here, starting at this has been aggregated so that you can see the share of the various types of publishing. You can see starting from the top that the closed publishing, this is at an article level, by the way, not at a journal level, has been diminishing quite significantly, and that has been taken up by hybrid journals. So in other words, it means that fully closed journals are becoming hybrid and giving researchers the opportunity to publish open access, but this light gray represents researchers who chose to continue to publish behind the paywall. And then the light blue represents the authors who chose to pay an article processing charge in a hybrid journal. And the gold represents the fully open access publishing. And as you can see, that is on the increase as well. So why go for a transformational agreement? The status quo means that we're paying subscription fees to read, but then on top of that, usually outside of libraries, researchers and departments and the research offices are either funding APC charges unless our authors have been had their fees waived. So the costs have been doubling. A transformative agreement usually covers everything that was behind the paywall. However, in certain cases, it also includes gold open access publishing as well. And in certain cases, it also includes the administration of the publishing without having to pay an APC. It's premised on the work done by Open Access 2020 and a study they completed, which where they determined that of the 2 million odd articles that are produced a year, it was costing the system about 7.6 billion euros annually, which means that the cost per article was roughly 3,800 euros per article. However, we knew that at the same time, the average article processing charge was 2,000 euros per article, which meant that there was at least a 45% buffer within the system already. So there was more than enough money in the system to repurpose the reading funding to pay for publishing. Back to Delta Think, they've sought information from publishers, and the column on the left indicates the share of articles that are published open access compared to those that are published closed at roughly 30%. However, their share of revenue is only about 7% from open access publishing, and the remainder is from subscription fees, which clearly indicates that a system of paying to publish should be more affordable for the research system than a system of paying to read and paying to publish. So in order for us to determine whether we could flip or not, we collected the data from Web of Science for 2014 to 2019 for South Africa as at the April in 2020. And we added to that the reading costs, only those that went through SANLIC. We know that certain member institutions may not have participated in a SANLIC deal, but nevertheless would have been paying for the reading of certain individual journals rather than a package. That was excluded. And then we added to that the publishing costs. And to do that, we used the 2019 research output data and applied the 2020 publishing costs for publishing open access. And in the cases where we couldn't find a publishing fee, we applied an average of $2,200 US. And we converted all of this into a single currency for ease of comparison, and that being the US dollar. And this is what we found. The closed publishing in South Africa is still growing, or was still growing, albeit at a slower rate. And it is the real growth is happening in gold open access publishing. It's interesting that hybrid publishing open access in a hybrid journal is not really growing. In fact, it's declined. It had declined slightly. And so yeah, and when you see no DOI, that means that those articles, we couldn't identify whether or not it where exactly it was published. Oh, sorry, under what model it was published. So when you put that together, you get a picture overall of what was happening to South African publishing, that the growth rate was slowing down, and that most of the growth was in gold open access. So if you disaggregate if you aggregate that information, this is what we found is that, I think this is just another way of seeing the growth in the gold open access publishing. And whilst closed is growing in numbers, its share of the total publishing has declined significantly. So it's just a way of presenting the same information if you find it more helpful in this format. And again, that just helps you to see the faster growth in gold as compared to closed publishing. What was concerning, however, is that if you looked at when you applied the costs of publishing, and again, I must remind you that we used the 2020 APC figures or fees, you will see that the cost of publishing open access for the South African research system was doubling every 3 to 5 years, which clearly meant that something would have to give, and that this is simply not sustainable, especially when our budgets are declining and our purchasing power is declining. So where is South Africa publishing behind the paywall? The figure on the left shows you the share per publisher of the total articles, and you will notice that there are what we call the big five: Science Direct, Wiley, Springer Nature, Taylor and Francis, and Sage, who take up the lion's share. And then the rest of the Stanley deals, there are about 55 Stanley deals, and you can see that these five take up the biggest portion of that. And then there are about 38% of the articles that are published in journals and with publishers that are outside of Stanley deals. Whereas if you looked at the closed publishing, the publishing behind the paywall, those big five almost make up 75% or roughly 70% of the research output. Whereas if you studied the gold open access publishing, you get a very different picture compared to all of the articles. Suddenly those big five only make about 20% of the research output, and the remaining Stanley deals account for another 3% of the open access publishing. And the lion's share of the open access publishing is outside of Stanley agreements. So in this particular picture, please ignore the color, but this is the same data sorted by publisher, and by from the most open access, gold open access articles to the least. And with this picture, you can see that the big five are not at the top of the list, and that other publishers come to the fore. So what does this mean for the research system if we were to try and flip to open access? clearly, most of the closed articles that we would want to be able to be published as open access by repurposing subscription funding fall in the big five. In fact, they account for, I think it's nearly 80%. And so when you disaggregate the information like this, it becomes clear that the larger deals are the most logical places to start to negotiate transformative agreements to get the biggest bang for your buck. But the question is, would it be more expensive or would it be less expensive? And we then applied the information on the article processing charges. And what you see here, the two left-hand columns compare the status quo, the first column in 2020, compared to what if the whole lot were to be flipped overnight. And what this shows you is that if we were only to pay to publish, we would probably spend in the region of 44%. Sorry, we would spend about 55% of what we are currently spending when you combine subscription fees and publishing fees. However, if we were to flip the big five, we would achieve most of those savings just by having successfully engaged in successful transformative agreements with the largest five publishers. I must point out that this is a theoretical exercise and would not necessarily translate into this sort of a situation, and certainly would not translate into the situation overnight. Transformative agreements are intended to be transitional in nature. This slide just shows you our top, I think it is 9 or 11 publishing deals, which account for 93% of our journal spend, our paying to read. And all but one case of Taylor and Francis, it is a situation where it would be more affordable to pay to publish than to pay to read. And that's clearly because for various reasons we publish very intensively with Taylor and Francis. I've just included this slide because not all negotiations go smoothly, and if we were negotiating with one publisher this week who proposed a transformative deal that would increase our overall costs by 50%, which is clearly ludicrous. And if we can't get them to see the light, one would have to consider what the alternatives would be to unbundle the deal and rather subscribe for less content at a more affordable price. And there's a product called Unsub, which helps libraries to understand how they could unbundle their subscriptions and be able to ensure that their researchers get almost immediate, uninterrupted read access to whatever they need, but at a fraction of the cost. Another important resource and a point of cross-reference for the South African research output study is the Esac website, which proves to be extremely useful both as a registry of transformative agreements as well as providing a market watch. This, for example, is what you would find if you looked for South Africa on the website. You will see that this light pink represents a few transformative agreements that are already in place. It also shows where we're publishing gold open access and where we're publishing hybrid and closed research. If you also go on the registry, you can find that the agreements that are already in place. We're delighted to be adding a few more to this list in the coming weeks for 2022. Also on the same MarketWatch website, you can see that the research output and the number of agreements that involve the transformative agreements that are creating a rapid movement towards open access. You can see that this growth is exponential, and the number of articles that are becoming available and the number of deals are growing significantly. You can also look individually by publisher as to what portion of their research output is becoming open access, and the pink components is open access in hybrid journals that is as a result of a transformative agreement. So you could hover your cursor on the website and zoom in and see, for example, that's Springer Nature up to 2020 already had 11.9% of their content open access as a result of transformative agreements. They also provide the information by country, and here you'll see 36 countries that are participating in transformative agreements. And some countries like Sweden are approaching 70%. Well, they've passed 75% open access thanks to 65% portion in transformative agreements and the remainder in fully gold open access. So wrapping up my component of the presentation, the importance of data analysis in terms of our roadmap going forward to transition to open access is that it helps us to understand where and how our researchers are publishing. It helps us to analyze costs and to do modeling of how best to move forward and plan and account for the transition costs, and to allocate resources accordingly, and to help us also to monitor the offsetting arrangements in place and to ensure that what was intended is in fact being achieved, and obviously to help us to assess and reorganize funds. So in conclusion, it's clear that most of our open access is outside of SANEC agreements, and that open access is definitely here to stay and on the up across the world, and that in spite of this, most of South Africa's research remains behind paywalls, and that our science objectives will not be achieved unless we engage in transformative or transformational agreements, and yet our costs of publishing open access in the current system are doubling every 3 to 5 years. And these are the reasons why we are engaging in transformative agreements. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Ellen. Ellen, for some reason, we can't hear you. I can see you unmuted, but we still can't hear you.
If possible, Ellen, can you log out and log in again?
Perhaps I could just speak on the Well, I see there's a question about the global north, but we could wait. Do you want me to take that now or wait until Ellen has concluded?
Let's just see. Ellen has just joined. Ellen, just try
Yes.
again.
Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how much time do we have so that you have time for questions, I'm sure?
About 10 minutes more, Ellen.
Okay, yes, I can definitely do it on that. So as Glenn shared with you, and as I've indicated earlier on, this was the first step. Secondly, we then worked on a statement so that we can understand exactly if we're going to start engaging around transformational agreements, that we clear what is the basis, taking into consideration our own context. In addition to that, of course, as we know, there has been an increase in funder requirements, which require researchers to publish in open access journals. So there's been an increase in the demand, and we know many institutions, in some institutions, the researchers have to fund these open access publications themselves. Some get it through their grants, others their libraries have, and I noted Professor Leslie Swartz is here. I remember, I think a year or two ago, when he was trying to find funding to publish a book open access. So we had to take all of those things into consideration. And out of that, then, we developed these principles for the transformational transitions to OA in South Africa, keep benchmarking with other countries, especially Australia, as well as in the US, so that we have a clear strategy when we start negotiating it. And in the case of South Africa, we wanted to make sure, based on what I've already said, that these agreements must promote accessibility. Glenn, you can, next slide. Must promote accessibility to local research, because as we've seen from the data, and as we've also, not just from the data itself in terms of where we publish and how much we publish, but there's also quite a lot of publishing that's going on outside the Stanley deals. And of course, ultimately, it is that we want to promote accessibility to local research. And that's what is, uppermost in terms of us negotiating. We didn't just want to have the same kind of agreements that they have had for other countries, because as we know, the situation is very different. So we came up with 16 principles. I just want to highlight, and probably to a large extent, the first four, but number one, therefore, was crucial for us. And that is inclusivity and social justice must be core. And that publishers must have an equity, diversity, and inclusion plan that addresses the challenges of researchers in the global South. So that was, as we started to engage with publishers, they all noted that this was very important, that we want to raise it, and that they prepared to develop a model with us so that we can try and address that. Because there is a moral question, and although, if we move to pay for publishing, of course, it addresses one aspect of it. But are we going to fund and continue to pay the same amount of large sums of money to publishers when we also know that it will not address the needs that we have in terms of equity and diversity, etc. That it should be a single agreement for reading and publishing services. And of course, in South Africa and in many other parts of the continent, as we know, again, if we look at our history and, of disadvantaged institutions, if I can use that term still, then we also know that many institutions in terms of research output, so some will benefit those institutions that have a high research output, but many others will still require read access, and therefore that should not be compromised for our researchers, and that includes perpetual access and post-termination access. And then, of course, that we want researchers can publish full and immediate OA in their venue of choice. In addition to that, the others, and you will basically see there which ones of those, but I know the ones that have been addressed and that we already getting a lot of questions from not just institutions where we have shared these principles, but also from the publishers themselves. And that is that there should be no cap on the number of full and immediate OA articles, because again, if we want to promote local research, if we want to increase that corpus of local knowledge, then of course we want to grow our research output. Therefore, if we're going to go into deals where there's a cap on how much we can actually, even though people can read more, then it's not transformational. It's not helping us with our transformation agenda in South Africa. Then I'd just like to highlight also that, of course, that we want to make sure that the content must be discoverable and must support improvements in service and workflow for authors and administrators. We don't want administration that will require researchers, to have to spend a lot of time on doing the administration themselves. And it's the kind of service which some libraries have tried to also assist their researchers in the various institutions. So we can go to the next slide and rather see if there are any questions on the negotiations itself. So in terms of our priority plan then, based on these principles, we then looked and see, which ones, where do we want to start? Because it's clear many of the countries who have successfully implemented these transformative agreements, many cases it had taken them 2-3 years to get the results. Some of them have been negotiating, like in Germany, some institutions, for some publishers, they have not concluded the negotiations because they have not been able to reach an agreement. And some of those have been like for 6-7 years, where they had basically stopped subscribing to like, for example, Elsevier's Science Direct, where they were not happy with what Elsevier had offered them in terms of transformation. So we looked at, first of all, that we have signed then 3 agreements for 2021, and those are the 3 that you see on the screen. And then, so when we look then at, okay, so which ones would be the ones that we would start with, we prioritize then agreements because we knew that there were a number of agreements that are coming up for renewal in 2022. And these included some of the big 5 publishers that Glenn had shared with us earlier on. So, and in terms of the priority, in terms of the overall expenditure by South Africa on these products, the number of subscribers that we have, the research output associated with the agreement, the potential for saving, that we can utilize it for read access, as well as to promote more and support researchers to publish, and perhaps some of our partners in other parts of Africa. The evidence of previously negotiated transformative agreements from the registrar, Esac register that Glenn also indicated earlier on, and that an initial 3-year term is recommended then for each of these agreements. So, and as such, we have started with these negotiations. The publishers were informed these are our principles, and those that we are starting negotiations with, that we said that we would like to start with transformative or transformational agreements, were informed, and they all were very keen to start talking to us, and said that they can give us, like the best agreement that anybody had ever received. And of course, that was wishful thinking. It is clear from what they are presenting that from some of the offers that we received to date, that it's very unlikely that we would be able to conclude these negotiations for 2022. So in most of the cases, it's still ongoing. We are probably going to still do a lot of work and possibly look at some of the agreements for, starting in 2023. There has been one concluded, and Glenn, that's Sage Premier, and maybe Glenn can just, when I'm finished, just indicate, what that involves. So that's definitely one that will be added to the 3 then for 2022. And then you see the other ones that we're looking at, because those current agreements will expire at the end of 2022 in the case of the first 2, ACCS and Science Direct, and then 2024 and beyond. So, but as I said, it looks like we will still be busy with most of the negotiations that we have identified for 2022. So the idea, the process is that once after this first round of discussions that we started, that we will make an assessment, conduct an assessment during then each of the phases to ensure that all the key considerations are being addressed, including financial and administrative aspects. And we've learned from other countries, this is going to probably be the most important aspect as we move forward in terms of how we are going to handle the financial and the administrative aspects, because as we've heard from other countries, there will be losers and there's going to be winners. And how do we handle that? So who pays for what? Because if it's based on article output, we know that there is a huge imbalance in terms of per institution. So clearly, we would like to keep all the funding that we currently spend on the subscriptions in the pool, so that we're able to afford this and make it, obviously much more simpler for researchers when they decide where they can publish and so on. So we will then use this assessment to then formulate an OA model that will be fit for purpose. And as I said, based on those principles in terms of equity, inclusivity, and social justice. So, yes, I think I am basically, this is the last slide. That's correct, Glenn? Yes. So that's where we are. And I've also given you a bit of an update in terms of how the current negotiations are going. First, and maybe just as I said, Glenn can just mention on SAGE, it is quite clear, as Glenn said, the data is theoretical. The actual offers that we have on the table, it appears that all the publishers, those that we've started with, that they have an idea. Their thinking is that they're probably going to be able to double the income that they're getting from South Africa. And we've been trying to say to them very clearly, at this point in time, it's the subscription money that this is the only funds that we can make available for such deals. But they would, it appears that they think that this is an opportunity for them for us to increase and even get more money out of South Africa and offer us these publishing deals. But maybe Glenn, if you could just say something on the SAGE deal. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Ellen. Glenn, do you just want to hold that over? I see that there's some questions starting to pour in. I think there is a question where you can actually then answer this particular question about SAGE. Is that okay?
Sure. Do you want me to answer the SAGE question or another question?
No, I think we should actually start getting into the questions, which is now appearing on my screen.
Right.
But I think just try and find a opportunity where you can actually answer the SAGE question. I'm keen for us to actually get into the questions. So thank you very much, colleagues. I think everybody on this call will actually agree the mammoth work behind the scenes that had to be done to get to the point that we are now to understand where do researchers publish? Is it open access? Is it closed access, etc. I also want to express my appreciation and acknowledge sort of the big work that has to be done behind the scenes to actually make this work. It took quite a number of years to get to this particular point, is to really understand open access in South Africa. And I think this is quite important that we've reached this particular level of understanding, etc. And I can already see that it translates to perhaps a more positive future in terms of negotiating the actual licenses, etc. I mean, what these two speakers did not mention, you must remember in Stanley deals, there are research councils, etc., that also participate. And when it really comes to these different issues, it is really problematic and complex to make an understanding of it all. I would like to start in with a question. He's asked, dear colleagues, any comments on the global north, global south as analytical tools to see through the open access discourse?
Ellen, do you want to start, or do you want me to go?
You can
All right.
take that one.
I think a very important, the question of would paying to publish be worse, make the global south worse off or better off, is probably the biggest comment or criticism around transitioning to open access, because of lack of funds in the global south. But from what I can tell, no researcher can do research without being able to read first. And if one can eliminate the charges going to paying to read, and repurpose that to paying to publish, one is definitely in a better position. Often South America is cited as a great example of publishing open access without involving the traditional global north publishers. However, everyone forgets that South America is expending huge sums of money on paying to read the journals that come from the global north. And they would also dearly love to be able to repurpose that funding. So when looking at the cost, you've got to combine the cost of reading and the cost of publishing, and divide that by the number of articles that you publish in a particular venue. And then you can determine the real cost of working with that particular publisher. And so I think that's a very important consideration. Two other components to this is that many publishers, for example, PLUS has waived publishing fees to South African authors. They've been negotiating with us and have pointed out that in previous years, many of the article processing charges were not paid by South African authors. And they obviously have similar agreements with other global South countries. So that's important to consider. I think the other thing is that we are in a position to influence the world to think about using something like the purchasing power parity index to promote the idea of different author or publishing fees, rather not say author facing, but rather institutional facing publishing fees. And that there is a strong case to have a different fee for the global south and the global north.
Thank you, Glenn. Ellen, do you want to add something?
No, not at this stage. Thanks.
Thank you so much. The next question then is, to what extent are you going to be able to achieve your negotiating principles? One, and then secondly, to what extent do these principles have the support of the scholarly community?
Ellen,
okay,
do you want me to go ahead, or you're going to do that?
Yes. So the extent we would be able to achieve these, as I have alluded to it, that it is probably not to a large extent based on the preliminary discussions that we've started. So there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And as I said, we will assess after this first round of discussions, regroup, re-strategize, and the idea is that we would then definitely involve the broader scholarly communication, as well as, of course, we're working with USAF, as well as with NSEF and the National Open Access project on the NSLOAP. So to see, of course, we're learning. We've participated in the Berlin 15 conference also recently, and the state of in all other countries. So definitely, there's a lot of work for us still to be done in terms of for us to be able to achieve these principles. And yes, as that addresses also the second question. We have, of course, informed and we have presented this to the principals to the NSLOAP. There will also be a discussion in November, December, when Glenn will present also the principles to the vice chancellors. And then the idea is also, of course, the DVC's research have been, the principles have been shared with them. We have this forum now here, and every opportunity that we get to share this during Open Access Week, 2 weeks ago, I know many libraries have also dealt with this in their institutions, and also, University of Pretoria, for example, have had a session and several other sessions where these have been shared also with researchers in that regard.
Thank you, Ellen. Igor, I saw that you raised your hand. Would you like to jump in right here? Just unmute and yourself.
Thank you. Igor Gledhill here. I think studies like this are absolutely critical before taking major decisions on amounts like 600 million rand. And so I'm delighted to see these studies because hopefully they prevent unintended consequences. I would like to ask about sensitivity studies within these. How sensitive is the study in terms of future-proofing to two things: the number of publications rising in South Africa and to the purchasing power in South Africa? And the reason I ask this is there are two major drivers. We want to publish more as a country, as researchers, for our research standing, for our international competitiveness. And the other driver is that the cost is per article published, so we want to publish fewer articles in order to drive the cost down. We have drivers working in different directions here. Out of my question comes, how does one future-proof the plan given these drivers' intention with one another? Thank you.
Glenn?
That's a tough one, and I hope I have understood the question well. But if I could begin by pointing out a few things, maybe using the example of SAGE. The agreement we've reached with SAGE is a 3-year agreement with uncapped publishing. So I'm trying to answer Robin's question as well as adding the SAGE issue and the current question. So it's at an increase of 3% per annum, which is sort of average to high in terms of the sort of inflationary increase that normally happens on a reading deal. So almost for the same price that we used to pay for reading, we now have unlimited and unfettered ability of any South African researcher to publish with SAGE. And what will happen is that when that researcher submits their work, they would be immediately, and this is where the workflow and administration problems come in, they will immediately be informed by SAGE that their institution, if they are the primary corresponding author, they'll be informed that their institution is part of a deal with SAGE and that they have the right to publish. The default would be open access. In terms of certain researchers might choose not to publish open access, they can at that point say, I do not want to publish open access. But what is key here is that this is a transitional arrangement. And after a certain number of years, the funding for paying to publish is going to diminish and dry up. And which means that each journal will have to stand on its own reputation in terms of peer review and other quality-related services, as well as cost. So if you can get the same quality of peer review and publication services at a different venue at half the price, guess what? You will go for the second one. Because of it being open access, your ability to be read by the world is equal no matter which of those two venues you choose. So I think that in the past, there was only one place that you could go to purchase a service of reading, because everybody had handed their copyright over to the publishers. In the new system, there's a vast amount of choice and therefore greater level of competitiveness in the system, which will hopefully continue to drive costs downward for article, for paying to publish. I hope I've kind of answered that question. Just to the last thing, I just wanted to say that to what extent are we achieving those principles, those negotiating principles? The two that there seems to be a problem with is the cap on the number of articles being processed, as well as the cost. The rest of the principles, the publishers tend not to have a problem with. And incidentally, we chose those principles by tapping into systems that have consulted researchers across the world. So we're quite confident that it addresses the needs of researchers.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm going to give Ellen also opportunity to respond. And then I'm going to go over to Kian. Kian, you will be then able to ask your question or your comment then live. Ellen, first you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Susan. I just want to make a comment on the question around the future proof of the plan. This is an issue that came up very much at the Berlin 15 conference, that those countries who have already signed a number, and as we've heard, where they have 60-75% open access, they already published, that's the percentage of their publishing in those countries in open access. The caution has been put out there that we have to be careful, and that we, because if we're going to go the same route as we have with APCs, and at some point, when we go into these deals, and I think some of the points made are actually very valid, because unless we make sure that the price increases in APCs in the future don't go the same route as it did with subscriptions, then we have just swapped one evil with another evil. So it's going to be a global issue. We are going to have to find a way how we can address this globally. This is definitely not something that we can do per country. And those are some of the things that we will have to look at to make sure that the plan is future-proof. So indeed, also still work to be done on that in that regard.
Thank you, Ellen. Kian, over to you.
I put on a comment which anybody can read, but what comes to mind in participating in this discussion is just how complex publishing is becoming as we go through a transition from closed access to open access and in between. And one of the comments that often comes up in my discussions with other editors is the fact that neither universities nor our authors really understand the publishing value chain. To them, publishing just happens. Send in an article and somehow or other it appears and somebody else absorbs the cost and you just move on to the next one and bank your DHET incentive. Throughout this meeting, I've made a number of comments on the chat about the fact that funding for covering APCs and open access costs can come out of the DHET incentive. But I think many of our authors don't want to think of that because it means less money for other purposes. So I think that we have to educate both our universities, particularly the research officers, and our authors as to the value chain, how it works, how it's changing, who's paying, and that there's always a cost involved somewhere along the line, whether you're reading or you're writing or you're publishing, or whether you're an editor. Okay, the opportunity costs are hidden. That's what I was talking about yesterday. Those have to be now brought to the surface and explained within this new value chain that is beginning to emerge and how it's going to benefit the entire global academic system, but how we also have to invest in it, not only at the level of securing funds from our university, but also our own, investing our own funds that come into us with respect to those universities which top slice a portion for the author themselves. Investment occurs at every level. Costs occur at every level. They have to be met at every level. And we can't have the situation where the journals are absorbing all the costs of publication and the authors claim that their intellectual labor is their side of the coin. Because to amortize their side of the coin involves entire production lines and websites and publication structures to bring the article to the reader, whether it's by open access or closed access. So it comes back to the bigger picture of educating the entire academic enterprise as to how this all works. Thank you.
Thank you, Kian. I'm just going to combine a couple of things here, namely, somebody asked a question, is there still hope for us? Because we've highlighted actually quite a number of challenges and sort of the complex nature of this beast, etc. And all the participants and stakeholders that needs to be convinced about this particular issue. So what is your sort of future view on where are we heading? How successful are we going to be in this endeavor?
So, Susanna, are you asking us to address that?
Yes, please comment, sorry.
If I look at this again from the global perspective, if I consider the impact of the pandemic, I think the momentum is quite in our favor, that we will have a new a scholarly communication system that will address the issues that we have highlighted. I think the writing is on the wall that the current system cannot continue, and that the success of those countries, although of course in many cases rich countries with a high research output, who has a lot of power and having been able to source this, but if we do take this step, and South Africa certainly is in a position, although of course in terms of the percentage globally, our research output is not that high, but in terms of the amount of output for South Africa, and then also them looking at South Africa to where they really want us, to participate in this. I think it is possible. I don't want to make a projection. I know they're now looking at possibly 2024, but as Glenn had shown also in the data, if we see the increase in open access publication, that there's an increase, and of course, also a decrease in some of the closed articles, that it is quite possible that we would be able to make that shift, and some of the publishers had started to accept that. The main thing is we will probably get also to a point where we're going to have to say, that we would be able to walk away if we don't, if we are not able to achieve, the principles that we had set out for ourselves. But we have to make sure when we do that, if we take that step in South Africa, that we have sufficient alternative ways in which our researchers are not disadvantaged by not having access to research material for them to conduct their research and to publish. That's my view. It is. I think I'm positive that we can do this. Lynn, you want to add?
Yes, I'm extremely positive. Certainly, I believe that 17% of South Africa's research is funded by Plan S funders, and they've actually set a deadline on the funding of article processing charges in hybrid and closed journals. I forget the exact year that it ends, but I think it's the end of 23 or 24. So those publishers who do not jump on the bandwagon stand to lose a lot of research. And from the discussions we've had already, it's clear to me that most of them have in fact already embraced the fact that the future is a model where one pays to publish. I'd like to also point out on a very practical example, we're also part of the Scope 3 project, which is a high energy physics publishing agreement sorted out by CERN, which is open access and a sort of a crowdfunding model where South Africa makes a small contribution to the pot. One of the big publishers of high energy physics refused to be part of the agreement, and they discovered that the numbers of articles being submitted to them was declining, and they realized that their future remained by participating in the Scope 3 agreement, and they then came on board. I also am very positive because with the Scope 3 agreement, they've managed extremely low annual increases, usually at 0% annually, for a number of consecutive years. So I'm positive that it can contain costs. I'm positive that it can address all our researcher needs, and I'm certain that it would help us with time to manage down our costs of communicating research. Kian, I wonder if you could perhaps rephrase your question, because it doesn't entirely, I don't entirely